Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let us start this Audit Trainer of Trainers virtual workshop. My name is Kalina Shukarova Savovska, and I'm a Senior Financial Management Specialist at the WorldBank Center for Financial Reporting Reform in Vienna. It is my pleasure to welcome you today, and this distance learning event will be about receiving a few updates from the International Assurance and Auditing Standards Board and the IFAC SMP Committee. This event is organized under the EU-REPARIS program and the Audit Trainer of Trainers component. It is made possible by the generous financial support of the European Union. Let me also use this opportunity to thank IFAC and the members of the IAASB who have provided significant support in delivery of the Audit Train of Trainers workshops. The objectives of the today virtual event are to update the participants on the developments of the IAASB and the IFAC SMP Committee in the last year, and to also provide some insights into their priorities for the next 12 months. So the past year has been very rich with ongoing initiatives at the International Auditing and Assurance Standard Board aimed at focusing on enhancing audit quality. For example, there has been a consultation paper on enhancing audit quality, a focus on professional skepticism, quality control, and group audits, which is to assist with further revisions to ISA. There has been a proposed project to revise the standards on auditing, accounting estimates, and risk identification and assessment. And also the board has published several discussion papers to consult on non-audit topics, including the growing use of technology in audit. IFAC's small and medium-sized practices committee also continued to develop and share resources on the implementation of the IAASB international standards, as well as to provide inputs to the IAASB projects and to continue to build the capacity of the SMPs globally. We will have two distinguished speakers today. We have Megan Zietsman, who is the IAASB incoming deputy chair. Megan has more than 26 years of experience as a practitioner and is a partner with Deloitte & Touche in the USA. Megan is part of Deloitte's Technical Advisory Board and leads the firm's global development and maintenance of audit practices and guidance. Dawn McGeachy is an assurance and accounting partner in the firm Golby McGeachy Professional Corporation. Dawn has been a member of the IFAC Small and Medium Practices Committee since 2013. After serving as a technical advisor for 7 years. Here in Vienna, joining is also a familiar face from the Audit Train of Trainers program, Piotr Piziak, who is a CFRR consultant, will be facilitating this session together with me. And we also have our colleague Denise, who is also going to be joining us for a while. Let me also say a few words about the venues, participants, and some other technical notes. We have participants who are joining through WebEx connection or VC connections. VC connections are made with Tirana, Sarajevo, Pristina, Skopje, Podgorica, and Belgrade. We also have participants from Romania and Bulgaria who are joining via WebEx. Let me remind everybody again, in order to have a successful session, please make sure that microphones are turned off at your VC locations when you are not speaking. Participants who are joining via WebEx, please make sure that the mute button on your computers is turned on when you are not speaking. If you have any technical issues during the session in a VC room, please call CIT support. In case you have some problems with WebEx, please redial to join again. Okay, so now we can start with Megan Zietsman. Let me pass over to Megan and ask her to speak about the IAASB updates over the past year and the priorities for the future. So Megan, over to you.
Hi, Kalina. Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to have the opportunity to talk to you today about the activities of the IAASB. So with that, let me get actually then onto the next slide, which will give you just a little bit of a background about the IAASB. So the IAASB is an independent standard-setting body. Maybe, Kalina, I'm not sure if there's a delay on the slides. I'm seeing the first slide. If you can maybe go to the next one. There we go. Great. Thank you. So we're an independent body, and we serve the public interest by setting high-quality auditing, assurance, and other related standards. So what I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about is all the different things that we have on our agenda, some of the recently completed projects in those three areas. Our focus is really to have standards that will enhance the quality of audits and other services, and also have a basis for uniformity of practice throughout the world. And it's through this focus that we look to strengthen public confidence in global auditing and assurance as a profession. We have a very rigorous and transparent due process that we follow in developing our pronouncements. And as we work through our process, we obtain input from a wide range of stakeholders. So we can do a number of different things. Kalina mentioned in the introductory remarks the extensive consultation that we did last year on our invitation to comment, which addressed professional skepticism with audits and quality control, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. But that's one example of an outreach that we performed before we actually got into setting up a project. As our projects actually become official standard-setting projects, we then follow a process to develop an exposure draft, which will then get published for public comment. And then depending on the different projects, we may also conduct different types of outreach. So for example, when we were doing our Auditor Reporting project, we did a lot of extensive outreach through roundtables and the like to bring different groups of stakeholders to talk about the issues. We have a full-time chairman, and then the rest of the board is comprised of volunteer members, and there's a balance between practitioners and non-practitioners. So of the 18 members, there's 9 practitioners and 9 non-practitioner members. We're overseen by the Public Interest Oversight Board, and their charge is to make sure that we do adhere to our due process. They observe our meetings, they observe the meetings of our consultative advisory group, and comment on the projects as they're going along, and then will to give us input if they think that there's things that we need to be doing or thinking about as we go. And then at the end, when the board approves a final project or a final standard, the PIOB then goes through a process to affirm that we went through our due process, and that's the final step in approving a final standard. We also have a group called the Consultative Advisory Group, which is the group that provides strategic and technical advice to the board. And that's a group that comprises about 30 or more than 30 international organizations. So there's a diverse membership of that group, which includes investors, regulators, preparers, policymakers, and others. The CAG meets twice a year in person to provide input to the board, and when they meet, the chairs of the respective working groups or task forces will make presentations to the CAG about the different projects. And then, as needed, we also meet with the CAG via teleconference if we need their input in between the 2 live meetings. So, Kalina, maybe then let's go on to the next slide, which is a slide that really just depicts on a map the global adoption of the clarified ISAs. So some years ago, the IAASB completed a very significant project to clarify all of the international standards on auditing. And this was a project to update some of them, but also just to kind of put everything into the same format where we have the very clear format that we follow for each of the standards that puts the requirements into one section and then all the guidance in a separate section of the standards. And then we've gone through a process of really rolling out the implementation of these ISAs across the world. And as you can see from this map, there is 113 jurisdictions around the world who are already using the clarified ISAs or who have committed to using them in the very near future. All right, so let me turn now to talk a little bit about some recently completed projects. So the two, and maybe just go to the next slide, that I'm going to talk about are Auditor Reporting and then NOCLAR, and that's an abbreviation that stands for Non-Compliance with Laws and Regulations. So that was a project that actually was initiated in the Ethics Board, which is a sister board to the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, and they commenced a very significant project to look at responsibilities around non-compliance with laws and regulations. And then there was a need to look at the international standards on auditing and the rest of the IAASB's international standards for not really conforming changes, but really changes so that there would not be inconsistency between the International Ethics Code and the international standards. So let me talk first a little bit now about auditor reporting, because that has been a very significant focus of the board in recent years. So why did we embark upon this project? So this was, like I said, a multi-year project that was really responding to a lot of stakeholder demands to look at the auditor's report and enhance its communicative value. So users were calling for really for auditors to be telling them more. So a lot of calls from investors and others for auditors to be providing just more information about the audit to help them in having just more information available to make investing and other types of decisions. And there was also just a need to look at some of the other elements of the auditor's report, make it clearer that the opinion should stand out more prominently, and things like that. So some of the changes here were really to be focused on the continued relevance of an audit. I think in all the consultation and the outreach that happened around the auditor reporting project, that was affirmed by broadly across stakeholders that the audit is still valued, and this interest in the auditor's report, kind of bore that out. There was also a focus on looking at the way in which enhancing the report might actually drive improvements in audit quality and enhance professional skepticism. So as you say more in your report, the thought was that you would actually then be more attentive to the underlying quality of the matters that were being communicated in the auditor's report. Something that was also hoped for, and that I think that we've started to see in some of the early implementation or countries where there's been some early implementation, is also enhanced preparer focus on the key financial statement risk areas and disclosures. So in the places where we have the communication of critical audit matters, key audit matters, they would be related to areas in the financial statements, and that would cause the company to sit there and actually focus on the way in which those have been disclosed in the financial statements. So sort of some synergistic benefits being seen there. I mentioned the communicative value. I think another benefit of looking at the changes to the auditor's report were also to try to stimulate more robust auditor interactions with the audit committee and with more broadly with the user community. And then another driver was really also to try to enhance the user's understanding of what an audit is and what the auditor does. So this is the long-standing expectation gap that has existed for many, many years, that the thought was that there was more information in the auditor's report about what an audit really was, that would be one way to try to at least move to narrowing the expectation gap to some extent. So maybe let's go to the next slide, which just summarizes the auditor reporting implementation. So really somewhat of a global journey. And the enhanced reporting, really, the UK kind of took the lead in promulgating some new requirements for auditors, directors, and audit committees, and that started back in 2013. So they've already got a good 3 years of expanded auditor reporting under their belt. The Netherlands also took on some early implementation, and in fact, they started to require some of the things that the IAASB was proposing back in 2014, and they required that for audits of public interest entities. And then what we've seen when the IAASB finalized their standards at the end of 2014 was that over the last year or two, we've had some, what Professor Arnold Schulder, who's the chair of our board, likes to call the early birds, to do a little bit of experimentation and try out the new style auditor reports, including the reporting of key audit matters, which are the matters of most significance in the audit. And you'll see some of the flags of the countries, so Hong Kong, Australia, South Africa, Switzerland, Poland, Germany. And then we've also seen in Zimbabwe, that's the flag next to mandatory dry runs. They've actually done some literally mandatory dry runs for listed entities in Zimbabwe. And then you see the next bullet is that auditor reporting ISAs come into effect for December 2016 year end. So in fact, it's actually for year ends ending on or after December 15th, 2016. So tomorrow is actually the key day. And in fact, if you go over to the IAASB's website, there's a resource page that has a lot of good support materials for auditor reporting implementation. And there's a clock that's counting down. So I actually went to look at it yesterday, and it was saying 1 day and however many hours. I haven't looked today, but we're into the final day. We've also seen in the European Union the requirements around enhanced auditor reporting for all public interest entities being required to come into effect in 2017. And then in the U.S., the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, which is the board that oversees audits of listed entities in the U.S., they've been working on an auditor reporting proposal, which is going to be very similar to the new ISAs. And that was reproposed in May 2016, and the PCAOB are working hard on trying to finalize all of that so that they can approve it, and it can come into effect at some point in the very near future. So it remains to be seen exactly when they finalize it, but it's a very active project on their agenda, and their final proposal was their final reproposal was very closely aligned with that of the ISAs. So let's go on to the next slide, which just talks a little bit about what the IAASB is doing to monitor auditor reporting. So we're actively monitoring and trying to support the implementation of these new reporting standards, recognizing that they are a big change. Like I said, we have globally, there are many adopters that are out ahead of the effective date, which is now actually upon us. And so some of the things that we've been hearing about how this has been beneficial, these are some of the remarks from one of the earlier slides, is that the standard reporting has been very useful from the perspective of users when they've looked at the understanding of the matters that are reported as key audit matters and the related aspects of the financial statements. In the UK, they've actually provided UK Investor Awards for the most insightful and most innovative auditor reports. So there's definitely a lot of innovation and a lot of interest and a lot of excitement. We've also seen that the people are talking about improved engagement between management audit committees within group audits, enhanced focus on disclosures, improved perceptions of the auditors, better risk identification, and really an easier ability for the EQCR to focus on those key audit matters. So a lot of I think the expected benefits are starting to be seen, although of course it's very early days. Some of the things that we've heard about, things to bear in mind, is that auditors need to write with the audience in mind. And you know, that's a little different than writing stuff that's going to be for the purposes of audit documentation, or even in an auditor's report that was much more standard or you could argue boilerplate language. You're now really trying to write something that will be interesting and also clear language so that investors can actually understand what you're talking about. So that can be it's a little bit of a different mindset in terms of how you write these types of auditor reports. So with that in mind, we are encouraging teams to start early, start thinking about what the potential key audit matters would be right up front at the planning and early stages of the audit, and then really start to engage with management and the audit committee early as you think about those. Start the drafting early. Don't leave it all to the last day, because it will take some time to get it all finalized. And then just at the bottom of the slide are some examples of some CAMs, and you can actually go and look at the report on the audit of the New Zealand government and of HSBC. Those are some good examples of some of the ways that people are applying the new standards. So with that, let's go to the next slide. And I mentioned that the IAASB has a website. In fact, I should have mentioned we have an Auditor Reporting Implementation Support Group. So we have a working group that actually comprises, or actually is chaired by Dan Montgomery, who's the former Deputy Chair of the IAASB and who was the person who really led the whole Auditor Reporting project. So we're very fortunate to have him leading this implementation working group. And then there's a number of others who have been closely involved with the project along the way, who are driving the charge there. The IAASB has a number of publications that are available that will support implementation. So really some summary sheets and the basis for conclusions for the standards. Publications specifically on the aspects related to growing concern and CAM, which is key audit matters, some illustrated examples. Then there's also a comparison between the ISIS and the PCAOB reproposal, so that's useful just to see the similarities, and there are a couple of little differences. And then there's also another publication that really is focused on what audit committees and finance executives need to know. So some really useful stuff, and we've actually just recently published a series of Q&As, which are a summary of questions that have come into this group from practitioners and others around the world around how to apply the standards. And I think the idea is that as we continue to get questions, we will continue to update that series of Q&As. So certainly lots to help, and we are very interested in hearing people's experiences, but also questions. So don't hesitate to reach out with issues and things like that we might be able to help with. So with that, let me switch gears and now talk a little bit about the NOCLAR project. So on to the next slide. This is like I mentioned, the non-compliance with laws and regulations. So from an IAASB perspective, it was focused on some limited amendments to ISO 250, which is our standard that deals with compliance with laws and regulations. But there were also some conforming changes to some of our other international standards. And really what we're trying to do here, like I said earlier, is to make sure that there really weren't any inconsistencies with the IASB code. Of course, we realize that there are jurisdictions or instances where audits are done using the IAASB standards, but where the relevant ethical requirements are not the IASB code. So we have to be sensitive to making sure that we don't kind of make something unworkable, but at the same time, we need to make sure that the IASB code and the international standards work together. So from the IASB changes perspective, and I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but what's summarized on the bottom of this slide is really the overview of what the IASB project encompassed. And it was essentially to create a framework for deciding how to act when a professional accountant becomes aware of a NOCLAR or a suspected NOCLAR. So that just also worth remembering that the IASB code applies to public accountants in business as well as the public accountants who are practicing, so practitioners. So there are separate sections of the code that deal with requirements for the different types of professional accountants. But broadly, there are now some specific communications that are expected with management and those charged with governance to assess the appropriateness of responses to non-compliance and determining whether further action is needed. There are requirements to communicate identified or suspected non-compliance with laws and regs to other auditors. For example, in a situation where you have an audited group financial statements and something gets identified at a component level, there are new guidelines and requirements for how communications amongst the auditors in the group should take place. And then there are responsibilities to determine whether further action is needed, which may in some cases include reporting to an appropriate authority outside the entity. And there are some new documentation requirements to demonstrate compliance with the requirements of the revised code. These new requirements go into effect on July 15, 2017. So it's not quite in effect, but will be shortly. So let's go to the next slide, which just describes the IAASB's limited amendments. So what we did most of our changes were focused on ISO 250, as I mentioned. And what we did there was to make sure that the definitions of non-compliance and the examples of laws and regulations that were outlined in the code align with that is within ISO 250. And the intent was to keep these keep the scope the same. So the definition of no-cloud being the same in the ISIS and in the IAASB code, and the examples to be the same. We also made some clarification to the requirements about what the auditor is required to do when they find a no-CLAR and determining whether to report it to an appropriate authority. So we had to make some tweaks to the requirements there. We also added some additional application guidance to highlight that the auditor may have additional responsibilities under law, regulation, or relevant ethical requirements, which would pick up these new revised requirements in the IAASB code. We had some enhanced consideration of the implications of no-CLAR on the audit. So, for example, if you do have a no-CLAR that involves management or especially senior management, to think about the reliability of management representations, the need for additional audit procedures, etc., and maybe actually even ultimately landing up to a conclusion as to whether or not you can actually continue with the engagement. The amendments do emphasize that there may be restrictions on communications, that precluded from the tipping off preclusions. And again, that picks up some of the guidance that actually sits now in the revised code. The IAASB changes have been approved and have been approved by the PIOB. They do go into effect for audited financial statements of periods beginning on or after December 15, 2017. And this was as closely aligned to the IAASB effective date as what we could do. So, normally when we finalize our standards, we like to allow at least an 18-month implementation period. But what we didn't want to do was to have a long period of time where the IAASB revisions would be in effect and the IAASB standards would not yet be aligned. So we did this project on an accelerated basis to get as close to the effective date as what we could. The other difference also is that the IAASB effective date is as of a point in time but when we look in the international auditing standards, we look at effective dates for the audits of periods or engagements of periods ending or beginning after a certain date. So that, it's really not very practical to have it be as of a point in time. So that was the thinking behind the effective date on the IAASB's amendments. So I think many around the world are busy thinking about all of these changes and getting ready to roll out or to implement them in the upcoming year. Okay, so I think that gives you a little bit of an overview of some of the most recently completed projects that the IAASB has been working on. And now let me turn to a focus on our current activities. And we have a number of very significant projects that are underway and that are keeping us very busy, and I think will keep us very busy for the next couple of years. But before we get into the details, let me just give a little reminder about what our current strategy is. So let's go to the next slide, which outlines the most important strategic objective that the IAASB has, is to ensure that our ISAs continue to form the basis for high-quality, valuable, and relevant audits conducted worldwide. And we try to do that by responding on a timely basis to the issues that are noted in practice and emerging developments. So it's a little bit of a balance. We have to deal with issues that would come to our attention, and we did a post-implementation monitoring study of our clarified ISAs. So a lot of the challenges and things that we are dealing with now in our current project came out of that study. But we also have ongoing outreach and interaction with audit regulators, with practitioners, and with others. And for example, we might hear things through our CAG about just things that are going on in the world, and the world, I think, as all of you probably will attest to, is not standing still. There's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of evolution in technology, both in the way that the companies are using technology or entities, but also in the way that auditors are starting to think about ways in which new innovative techniques can actually enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of audits and other engagements. So we need to make sure that our standards are not standing in the way of innovation and stifling the sort of experimentation and seeking out potential best practices of the future. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we have robust principle-based requirements that really do respond to the strategic objective of supporting high-quality engagement. So what we continue to do is to try to be focused on the emerging needs of stakeholders, in particular for services other than audits, and a little later I'll talk about one of our discussion papers that we have out there right at the moment that is looking at expanded or emerging forms of expanded reporting. And then we also have ongoing focus with our stakeholders to talk about the ongoing public interest matters that we should be focused on. You've just heard me talk about a very significant project where we had to coordinate with the IAASB, and I think we're recognizing that the coordination with the ethics board is increasingly something that's very important for us to be focused on. So, actually, we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Kalina. So the next slide is the public interest issues that we are focusing on today, and these we actually outlined in our invitation to comment on enhancing audit quality. We are focused on having that appropriately independent and challenging skeptical mindset of the auditor. We're focused on looking at proactive management of quality at the firm as well as the engagement level. It's really been foundational to the performance of quality engagements and audits in particular. We're looking at this call for transparency. So obviously our Auditor Reporting project is very closely aligned with this public interest issue, but there's also calls for more transparency about how firms manage quality and varying requirements around the world for different types of transparency reporting, and certainly in some jurisdictions more specific requirements. In other jurisdictions firms are reporting on a voluntary basis, but just a very increased level of interest and call for more information about quality and what firms are doing. We also focused on looking more at firms, including network firms, recognizing again that networks are organized in very different ways. So, even though you may be a network firm, you're not necessarily going to look like the next network firm, and many firms, some may be just really marketing alliances, and others may be firms that really are sharing common methodologies and policies and procedures. And we need to make sure that our standards deal with the different types of networks that can be out there. We also have calls to be looking at internal and external monitoring and remediation activities. And I think with increasing regulation of the audit profession, this is something that is a key area of focus for us, where we have a lot of focus on how firms are dealing with reports and findings of external regulators, peer reviewers, and the like, and really the focus on understanding those findings, getting into things like root cause analysis, causal factors, and the focus on remedial activities. So that's something that is very closely or very squarely a public interest issue for us. Also looking at the need for robust communication and interactions during the audit, so among the members of the engagement team, between group auditors and component auditors or other auditors who are involved in the engagement, and also having documentation that supports the way in which auditors have made their judgments. And we see that as being very important to also be able to provide evidence of how auditors have exercised appropriate professional skepticism. And then, like I mentioned, it's really the focus on keeping our ISIS fit for purpose, and we kind of use those words, I think, as opposed to trying to future-proof them, because I don't think it's ever possible to future-proof because the world is moving and evolving at such a rapid pace. So with that, let me go on to the next slide, which is the one that we call our House of Audit. And this is really a diagram that summarizes the key projects that we are working on that really are focused on the fundamental elements of the audit. So right at the basement, we have the Enhancing the Firm System of Quality Control. So this is our project to look at the ways in which firms manage quality. Sitting on top of that is looking at the focus on strengthening the application of professional skepticism. And those really do form the foundation for the standards that deal with more discrete topics at the engagement level. So we start with quality control at the engagement level, which very clearly builds on the firm system of quality control. And we're looking at the way in which quality can really be actively and proactively managed at that engagement level. So that's our project on ISO 220. We have a project that's looking at our very core foundational risk assessment standard, which is ISO 315. We have a very important project that's looking at the ISO 540, which is our standard on dealing with accounting estimates. And then we have a project that's looking at group audits, which builds on the project that's looking at 220 and really dealing with some of the very core and practical challenges that do occur in group audits. And I guess the roof over all of that is related to the objective of having standards to support high-quality audits, that really have them be standards that are principle-based so that they can be capable of being adapted as the business environment continues to evolve. So with that, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just really overviewing the key projects and talking about what the status is and kind of what we're wanting to achieve with each of them. So let me talk first about ISA 540, because this is the project that is the one that's on the fastest track right now, and we really are under a lot of pressure to get this one done quickly. So the objectives of this project, it actually started as a project to look specifically at challenges of audits of financial institutions. And there was a particular concern that with the coming effective date of IFRS 9 and the particular challenges around auditing the very complex estimates, in particular the estimated credit loss models and what have you, that there really was a need to make sure that the international standards were fit for purpose, capable of being applied. So as the working group got started and started to look into the issues and did some outreach, it became apparent, though, that the issues that were being put on the table as financial institution-specific issues were actually issues that applied more broadly to really audits of complex estimates. So with that, we decided that the project should really be a broader scope project, look specifically at the auditing estimate standard, to look at modernizing that standard, an update for the new accounting standard. So there's been a lot of evolution in the accounting standards, not just IFRS 9, but also developments in revenue recognition, the upcoming changes to insurance contracts, and just really an increased focus on fair value measurements in the accounting framework, and a need for us to really make sure that the auditing standard was keeping pace with all of that. So the core was to look at enhancing the auditor's risk assessment in the or enhancing in ISA 540 how the auditor actually applies the risk assessment model to these complex estimates, with a focus on their complexity, their judgment, and the estimation uncertainty, requiring a more granular work effort. And this has really been called for from a number of stakeholders, from the regulatory environment, but also this, and again, a lot of the core here came from, is coming from the banking regulators and other prudential regulators to really have a very focused work effort that does respond to the aspects of estimates that make them so important, so susceptible to material misstatement. But at the same time, and on the other end of the spectrum, is the importance of keeping a focus on audits of smaller entities, or audits of accounting estimates that are not as complex and give rise to lower or low assessed risks of material misstatement. So this is a focus on building scalability in the ISA, so recognizing that the standard is applying across the spectrum, and we've got to have the ability in the standard to scale the requirements and make it clear how you apply it across the spectrum. So let's go into a little bit more detail on the next couple of slides about some of the things that we are focusing on. So the first thing is to have a more enhanced understanding that will inform the risk assessment. So really focused on having an understanding of how management might make the estimate, and really thinking about that relatively independently, because this would also be seen as a way to try to mitigate the anchoring bias. So I'll get to professional skepticism in a little while, but what we're also trying to do is, as we go through each of our projects, is to have that professional skepticism floor or foundation, and we're thinking about it as we go. And I think we've decided that the best way to try to encourage better application of professional skepticism is not just through littering professional skepticism all over the standards, but rather to look at ways in which we can craft our requirements such that they are clear, or such that they really do encourage a more critical thinking or critical mindset of the auditor as they go about addressing these requirements, and then supported by appropriate documentation requirements that really do demonstrate the process that has been undergone to demonstrate the application of professional skepticism. So 540 would be a good example of how we're trying to do that and really make it clear that you're not just corroborating what management puts in front of you as an auditor, but that really that you are challenging what's put in front of you and really thinking about it critically, so that you're not kind of anchored in what's presented, that you're thinking more broadly about other things that might not necessarily have been presented, but which might potentially be contradictory or conflicting. We've also got to focus on the use of models and data, and this is specifically coming from the aspects of complex models, huge volumes of data. Some of these new estimates will really be very, very complicated and difficult to audit without thinking about how to actually address the challenges related to these models and volumes of data. And that includes data that might be coming from external sources. Important also to be thinking about the controls that companies are putting in place around the making of these estimates, and the governance and the oversight from those charged with governance or audit committees for those entities that have them. So the way in which we're trying to drill this down is to think about then different factors that might be relevant in assessing risks. And the three factors that we've identified and highlighted are complexity, the use of judgment, which would include the selection of methods, assumption, and data sources, and also a focus on estimation uncertainty, and in particular, sensitivity to particular data and assumptions. So with that background as the understanding, we then get on to the key change, which is on the next slide, is that we would have procedures that are directly responsive to the risks. Maybe if we just move to the next slide, we have a principle or overarching requirement, which is going to be to design and perform procedures that respond to the identified risk factors that relate to complexity, use of judgment, and estimation uncertainty, which will be required when those risk factors drive the assessed risk of material misstatement above low. And that's a really key threshold that we have in the standard, and this is a way to try to keep the scalability of the standard and not overload auditors when you're dealing with an estimate that just is on the low end of the spectrum from the perspective of the assessed risk of material misstatement. So we're still working on the drafting and kind of coming up with the final word, but the most recent draft that we were actually talking about at our board meeting last week will have a requirement that will say when you're on the low end of the spectrum, so your assessed risk of material misstatement are low, that you might think about whether an overall procedure, which would be aligned with the procedures that we have in the standard today, so for example, potentially being able to look at a subsequent event, or maybe look at an independent estimate that you've been able to develop, some kind of an analytical procedure, that might be acceptable. So a little bit less prescribed as to how to respond to those low risks. References back to ISO 330, which is our responses to assessed risk standard, but the sort of the more broad overall standard. And then what we'll have will be the next layer of requirement that will be very much more targeted on risks that are greater than low, so more than low, and then a focus on what to do with those. So we're hoping that will be a way that will actually enable the standard to be applied kind of across the spectrum, like I mentioned. We also have a new standard requirement that will be focused on standing back as to and really thinking about when you've completed all the work to address all the various different risks that might present themselves with respect to an estimate, have you actually obtained sufficient appropriate audit evidence? And we saw that again as an important way to really foster professional skepticism and really be critical of what you've done at the end. So going on to the next slide, I think for those of you who are very familiar with ISO 540, you will know that we do have some requirements in our existing standard that are specifically focused on significant risks. We still have the concept of significant risks, but those procedures will essentially now become part of the main work effort. And as we looked at those as a board, it was hard to argue why those wouldn't necessarily apply to any risk that is above low. So we've driven those into the new expanded work effort. With respect to external data sources, and this can be a very relevant factor when you're dealing with some of these more complicated estimates and you're having information that's coming, for example, from an external pricing source, and a recognition that the international standards today don't really deal a lot with this. Some of it is dealt with in our IAPN 1000, which is a practice note that deals specifically with the challenges of auditing financial instruments, and some of that material is being looked at to migrate into the new standard as application guidance. We're also considering, do we need a potential amendment to 500, which is our evidence standard that would deal with this whole notion of an external data source and deal with the question of when is it a management expert or when is it really just information that comes from an external source, and what are the implications for the next timing and the extent of the procedures. Specifically in the banking and insurance area, we are having some ongoing discussion about whether there should actually be some required testing of operating effectiveness of controls in some circumstances. And this is really to be responsive to the strong calls from the regulatory community for the importance of the focus of the auditor on the controls when you have these very large and complicated estimates. So a little bit of ongoing discussion that's still going on there. Let's go to the next slide, which gives you a little bit of a synopsis of where we are with respect to the timeline on this project. So we started at the beginning of January 2015. We put out a project update in March of this year, and we did that really to try to provide some increased transparency to what we were actually doing, but also it was a way to give a signal as to the direction of the potential standard, and also get auditors to start thinking about how ECL challenges and expected credit loss, ECL, could be addressed under the current standards. So recognizing that it was going to take some time to get our final standards approved, but also recognizing that the effective date of IFRS 9 is looming, and really a call a call on us to do what we could to make sure that people are starting to think about this. So that was a big driver to our project update, and it seems like it has been quite well received. We are working to an ED and targeting March 2017 for the ED of revised 540, and then aiming to try to finalize it early in 2018, so to align as closely as possible with that effective date of IFRS 9. So this has been a very significant focus and taken a lot of board time to get to this point, and I think we still have a little ways to travel. Once we get to the ED stage, we will also start to think about the need for practice notes that we might develop, and that would be companion pieces to the standard. We know, for example, we used to have an IAPN that dealt with implications of interactions with banking regulators and prudential supervisors, and that's on the agenda to be looked at in the near term, to be basically updated and republished. And then there's also a broader need to look at whether we need a broader IAPN that will deal more specifically with challenges for audits of financial institutions. And that's obviously, that work is yet to begin and still under consideration. So with that, let me now turn and talk a little bit about our project on ISO 315, which is our foundational risk assessment standard. So this one has been, again, also progressed on a fairly fast-track basis, because some of the concepts and issues that we're talking about in 315 actually are related to some of the issues that we're dealing with in 540. We don't have the liberty to wait on 540. In other words, we can't wait and get until 315 is done because of the pressure to get 540 done as quickly as possible. But we're trying to keep the thinking and the issues at least moving in the same direction. So the driver for our 315 project was, I think I mentioned a little earlier, the findings from some of our ISO implementation monitoring study, which talked about some of the challenges that practitioners have with respect to the standard. And the summary of the issues that we are addressing here is looking at our requirements to understand the entity, and really just a need for more clarity on how the auditor uses the information to identify and assess risk. So I think what we've heard is that the current standard has a whole list of requirements, but sometimes it's not very clear to practitioners and others how to connect all of those requirements with the actual risk assessment process. So we're looking at a way to try to make that a little bit more clear and really connect the dots a little bit better. With respect to the actual risk assessment process and identification of risk, we're exploring whether we should have a more explicit reference to a spectrum of risk. So what we're hearing is that, not all risks are created equal. You have ones that are on the lower end of the spectrum, less significant, less likely to result in material misstatements. And then right at the other end of the spectrum, you have the ones that are the most significant. And obviously, we have our concept of significant risk right up at the top end of the spectrum. And actually, the chair of this task force referred to those as the really, really scary risks. So I think it's the concept of the spectrum you can see in the current standard, but it's not very explicit. So the challenge is that if you were to be able to describe that more explicitly, you might provide us a better basis for the auditor to really tailor the nature, timing, and extent of procedures to address the different types of risk. Controls is a very important focus of all of this. We are looking at the role of controls in risk assessment, so exploring the extent of the understanding required, and really trying to make it clear why you have that understanding, why it's necessary to have that understanding, especially in instances where you maybe are going to do a substantive or heavy audit. So in other words, you're not going to necessarily rely a lot on the operating effectiveness of controls in addressing the risk of material misstatement. And then I think, we often hear from practitioners, well, why do I need to worry about controls as part of my understanding of the entity? So we really are trying to focus on the linkage between that necessary understanding and describe it in a little bit more detail, but also to try to address the scalability concerns. And I think we do hear different practitioners having different interpretations of the current requirements in terms of what they really need to do. So some work needs to be done there to try to clarify all of that. We also want to provide some increased clarity about those circumstances where standard procedures alone might not be enough. And there's also a need to have a focus on the risks and the controls that arise from information technology. So the current standard is not very extensive in terms of the way in which it deals with information technology. So a need to look at maybe updating it in that respect. So let's just go quickly to the next slide. Some of the other issues that we will address is modernizing it, as I said, for IT developments. We're also going to look at the documentation of our risk assessment process, looking at some of the definitions, language, and the structure. And we do hear, and I think in particular from smaller practitioners, that the structure of the standard is a little overwhelming. And if there's a way to make it a little bit more apparent as to how it all hangs together, that might improve the ability to apply it in practice. Professional skepticism is a key focus in the standard, and how we might focus on the understanding of the entity. And one of the things that we actually heard as we did our outreach on our invitation to comment was that the ability to exercise professional skepticism is very foundational on a thorough understanding of the entity and its environment. So we really are focusing on making sure that we have that right. And that foundation also then forms the right foundation for managing quality at the engagement level. So it has a link over to our project on ISO 220. So as mentioned in the last bullet there's lots of connections to other standards, and this project ultimately will probably result in some consequential amendments to other standards in addition to 315. The bullet I jumped over there was data analytics. Thinking about that, and I do have a slide later on which talks a little bit about the IAASB's focus on this area. But we are looking at ways in which we might be able to describe and illustrate a little bit about how innovative techniques are being used in risk assessment and what those mean for the process. Okay, so let me move on now and talk a little bit about our ITC, which is our invitation to comment, which deals with our significant project. So as Kalina mentioned in the introductory remarks, we conducted this outreach through a very extensive invitation to comment document last year. High level, what we heard from our stakeholders was that we should be keeping our standards and maintaining them in a way that they are adaptable to this wide range of circumstances. So we have to balance the needs of all of our different stakeholders. We need to take into consideration emerging issues such as technology, increasing business complexity, and risk to ensure that our standards remain relevant. There's a number of other matters that some of them are relevant to our standards, some of them are relevant to the ethics board standards, and some of them are things that really are the ambit or the authority of others, but we have a role to play. So some of these include things where issues have been raised around the way in which firms remunerate personnel, independence, particularly in relation to non-audit services. We heard loudly and clearly that audit teams need to have the right time, they need to have the right senior people, they need to have the right skills to probe for issues. The fee needs to be commensurate with the complexity of the engagement, and that really is the foundation for quality engagement. As I mentioned earlier, we heard that transparency is important, and we heard a keen interest from our stakeholders in other external reporting and questions about the role of the auditor. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, right towards the end of this, where I'll talk about our discussion paper that's exploring that in more detail. So let's talk quickly now about professional skepticism. So let's go to the next slide. So summary of the issues, and I think what we heard from our stakeholders was that professional skepticism is about the appropriate mindset of the auditor. It's not something that can just be fixed by changing the auditing standards. It's a very complex subject and really involves not only standards but also activities of others. It is about behavior. Auditors need to be encouraged to act as critical challengers. Like I mentioned, they need a sufficient knowledge of the business, and you really need to understand the business drivers to be able to effectively challenge management. So, really trying to understand what are the business objectives and then understand why management might be acting in a certain way or doing certain things. And that knowledge of the business really puts the auditor in the better position or the best position to quickly challenge the evidence that is obtained as the audit goes along. We heard a strong link between professional skepticism and the tone at the top, so the tone that comes right from the top of the firm. So we also heard this concept of the tone in the middle, which is really what I would call the middle management or the engagement level leadership. So important that not only the engagement partner, but also the engagement managers and the others supervising the less experienced staff on the team all need to have that right tone, and that needs to really trickle down to really support the application of professional skepticism at all levels. Training and education is obviously critical, and we heard about this concept of how education should really be designed in a way that it will infuse this professionally skeptical attitude into the DNA of auditors. So looking at the way in which education curriculums could actually be revised to be more case-based focused, for example. So instead of just, focusing on learning what is there, think about challenging what's not there and trying to infuse that into professionals as they learn. We heard affirmation that a joint approach by the IAASB, the Ethics Board, and the IAASB, which is our Education Standards Board, is really needed. And we have a joint working group that is looking at this, and the focus being the planned actions of the standard setting boards, all of whom are independent boards, but that they need to be aligned to match some of the impediments that they are designed to address. So at the individual level, the engagement level, the firm level, and then more broadly at the profession. So this is a very complex project and not necessarily something that's going to be solved by a once and done revision to the standards. So let's talk a little bit about the way forward on that. So on to the next slide. Like I mentioned, as we go about our different projects to make revisions to the ICES, we are going to be thinking about ways in which we can make those revisions to encourage more challenging behaviors. So there will be ongoing coordination between the IAASB members of the Joint Working Group on Professional Skepticism to really be challenged to think about this. The Joint Working Group will continue to be a central point for discussion of common issues, so thinking about what each of the different boards are doing and trying to keep aligned. And then we are exploring whether a thought piece or a feedback statement or some other kind of a brief publication might be useful in the near term. So this would communicate some of the results of the initial feedback and communicate things that the boards will be undertaking individually and in coordination. And then what this could also highlight would be the important role of management, audit committees, investors, others in educators, for example, in this whole debate. So lots more to come on this very interesting topic. Let's move now and talk a little bit about quality control. So we've got here the two projects that on quality control, first of all, dealing with quality control at the firm level, and then secondly, dealing at the engagement level. So at firm level, we are looking at a number of discrete issues that we have been called upon to strengthen or more explicitly address in our standards. So we've been called upon to make it very much more clear in the standards that we need to have requirements around firm governance, including leadership responsibilities and accountability. So looking at things like having governance principles and really putting that emphasis on tone at the top into the quality control standards. Pick up this concept of tone in the middle, pick up lead by example, pick up on-the-job training, all those types of things, and make that more explicit in our quality control standards. We've also got a number of issues related to the area of engagement quality control reviews and calls to strengthen and clarify those aspects. Calls to look at whether we should be expanding the requirements for the performance of EQC reviews beyond just listed entities, which is the requirement in the extant standard. So what we're currently doing is looking at whether we should have more robust risk-based criteria. We've debated probably fairly extensively at this point as to whether or not we should expand the requirement to extend to public interest entities. But I think we realize and acknowledge that the concept of a public interest entity is defined differently or applied differently in different jurisdictions around the world. So it's somewhat problematic to just make it make that be the gating the gate for the requirement. But there is a way to devise more appropriate and robust risk-based criteria that a firm might apply. So that's currently the direction that we're moving along. We've also been called to look about whether it's possible to enhance and clarify the nature, timing, and extent of the review and the eligibility of the EQC reviewer. So that would include looking at, for example, things like if the reviewer has recently been the engagement partner, should there be a period of time before such time as they can be the EQC reviewer, but also looking at things like the stature of the EQC reviewer and really making sure that it is an individual that is in the position to be able to effectively challenge the judgment of the engagement partner. Like I mentioned before, monitoring and remediation, a very key focus and something that we need to build out in our standard, which doesn't specifically deal with findings from external regulators and audit oversight bodies and root cause analysis and things like that. Big focus, sorry, excuse me, I'm going to have a quick glass of water. So focus on looking at the engagement partner performance and reward systems, making sure that those are really designed to incentivize good behavior, encourage professional skepticism, and really deal with things like human resources and engagement partner competency. Network firms is also a focus, and I think this is, we've tried to explore a little bit about whether it's possible or whether we should be thinking about a network level standard, and we've tried to explore that a little bit in our ITC. But like I mentioned earlier, I think we realize that networks are all a little bit different, and they're all structured a little bit differently. The degree of commonality of policies and procedures and processes can also be a little bit different, and all of those make it very challenging to devise a set of requirements that would be capable of being applied across the board. But what we did hear loud and clear was that we need to make it very clear in our firm level standard that where a firm is seeking to point to a network level process or procedure as the basis for addressing a firm level requirement, you need to have the basis for that reliance. So that is something that we need to explore in our quality control standards. And then we need to continue to be engaged in the debate and the activities around transparency reporting. I think we've also heard that it's probably not appropriate for the IAASB to establish requirements around transparency reporting, but that our standards should acknowledge that there are those requirements in a number of jurisdictions, and that there also may be circumstances where firms may want to voluntarily do some form of transparency reporting about quality control systems. So we need to stay engaged in that debate. So as we've looked at all of these different issues, what we've also been looking at is there a way to really improve the ability to apply ISQC1? So we've heard a lot about ISQC1 as a standard that is difficult to apply, that small practitioners find it very complex. It's a long standard. It's got a long list of requirements that all seem a little bit disconnected. It's also a standard that applies to firms that do not only audits but other engagements, and some firms may actually not even do audits at all, and then it becomes a very difficult standard because it's just long and complicated. So as we've talked about that, we've also been thinking about, is there a way to really make this standard more active, and can we build or infuse this concept of quality management into ISQC1 such that the output or the result will be a standard that is more scalable and proportional, so we have it be appropriately robust for the circumstances where the public interest aspects of the engagement is on the higher end of the spectrum. So you have specific requirements, for example, that might be applicable to audits of listed entities, but at the same time that you have the ability to really scale it and that it makes it more workable for firms that are on the other end of the spectrum where they're doing smaller audits or less complex types of engagement. So we're exploring this concept of the quality management approach, which we set forth in the ITC, and we've continued to sort of think and evolve with the process. And I think where we're coming out at the moment, and the working group is still working hard on framing this out, is that the standard should put forth that there are some foundational concepts. So the foundational components would consist of things like governance, leadership, the firm culture, the strategy, the information and the communication requirements, and the documentation of the system of quality control. And then on top of that, you build the quality management process, which is really an iterative process of determining what the quality objectives are, doing an assessment of the risks that those objectives might not be achieved, and then designing and implementing responses at the firm level to address those risks, and then a process to monitor and monitor the implementation of those responses and remediate as needed. So this middle box, which has got the green title, is really probably something that's a circle, and that would sit on top of the foundational components. And then we thought to really respond to the calls for making sure that we keep the standard sufficiently robust, but we also provide for the ability for scalability and proportionality, that we would have some minimum objective and responses that would deal with some of the specific aspects that are currently in ISQC1. So setting forth the minimum quality objectives and what the expected responses would be for certain circumstances. So we're hopeful that this will be a way that will enable the standard ultimately to be capable of being adapted by, capable of being applied by practitioners across the spectrum. Ultimately, we may decide that we need different standards, maybe for different aspects of this. So, for example, maybe a separate standard that would deal with EQCRs, for example. So making it very clear that that is only applicable in certain circumstances. We've also explored maybe different standards for firms that do different types of engagement. But I think we've heard some differing perspectives and viewpoints along the way, and it remains to be seen exactly how the output of this will fall. So let's move quickly now to quality control at the engagement level. And here what we're dealing with is ISO 220. We're looking at taking those quality management principles and driving them at the engagement level. So really looking at how risks to quality might be identified and responded to in terms of designing the appropriate direction, supervision, and review of the engagement at that engagement level. We're looking at enhancing the role of the engagement partner. We've heard loudly and clearly that we need to make that role robust. The engagement partner remains responsible for the engagement. We're looking at some issues around engagement acceptance and continuance, trying to put a real focus on making sure that that decision is made with the most informed information possible. And I think we've heard some challenges from regulators that in some cases auditors are accepting engagements that actually probably should not be accepted because they don't have the ability to perform the engagement. Maybe they lack skills, or maybe there's access issues that are so severe that it cannot be overcome, and it would be helpful for us to highlight that in our standards. This is a standard also that needs to really be capable of being adapted to a variety of evolving circumstances. And, we've heard in our outreach, and we've outlined some of this in our ITC, that there are engagements that have lots of very different types of circumstances. And some of them are driven by the way that entities are structured. So, for example, increased situations with use of shared service centers, centers of excellence, and the like. Also increasing situations where, due to law regulation or other circumstances, you have countries that operate in one jurisdiction but are required to be domiciled in another. And that drives then differences in ways in which the audits are performed. So we may have situations where the partner is necessarily located in a different location because of the requirement for the report to be signed in that location, but the work is actually done in another location. We also have increasing involvement in the area in which the firms are structured, so use of what we call audit delivery models, so outsourcing or centers of excellence and use of those types of models by auditors. So what we need is clarity in our standards as to how the principles of quality management at the engagement level can be applied to all of those different circumstances. We've also heard about needing to focus on effective communication among the members of the engagement team. So this standard really then forms the foundation for ISO 600, which is the next standard or the next project that we're looking at. And there's a number of issues with respect to 600. So it's again, a very large and complicated standard, and not surprisingly has some practical challenges. And some of this becomes driven by the variety of different group structures that you can have. So the Group Audit Standard project will build on the work that's been done with 220, but it will also try to deal with some of the specific issues that we're hearing. So again, the need for more communications, more robust two-way communication between group engagement teams and component auditors, aspects of using the work of component auditors, so looking at the focus on assessing competence and independence of component auditors, trying to figure out the extent of the necessary involvement of the group engagement team in the work of the component auditor, looking at the work on significant and non-significant components, and does that model really drive the appropriate focus on making sure that risks of material misstatement have been effectively responded to at the group level. We've heard calls to look at the ways in which component materiality is determined and applied, and the need for maybe more guidance and standard as to how that should be done, which includes also addressing the concept of aggregation risk. There's also some issues around looking at making sure that it's very clear what the work effort of the group engagement team is in relation to the consolidation process, and then looking at the overall wrap-up and whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained. So this standard, like I mentioned, very closely aligned with 220. It's also very closely aligned with our project on 315. So as we clarify some of those aspects that I was talking about in 315, we'll need to flow that through into our group audit standard. I should also mention on this one, we've also heard that, we need to make sure that as we do this standard, we think about the fact that we don't have discrete standards for auditors that act or serve as component auditors, but that there is a need to make it clear in the standard what the requirements and the expectations are of those types of auditors. So I think we heard that we don't need a separate standard for component auditors, but as we deal with the requirements for what, for example, a group engagement team should do, we should be thinking about maybe what the sister requirement would be from the perspective of the component auditor or the auditor who is on the receiving end of those instructions, and think about how we might incorporate that into these standards. Okay, so I know I'm getting close to the end of my time, so let me then just talk a little bit now about some of our other projects where we're actually in the process of doing some outreach. So we have our data analytics request for input. So, I think our standards today don't prohibit, but they also don't specifically stimulate the use of data analytics. So we've heard that we need to do a better job of really increasing the focus on the use of data analytics. We want to be cautious though here and not necessarily get into the situation where we inadvertently limit something or preclude innovation, but we also want to be careful that we understand exactly what the challenges are before we jump into making changes to our standards. So we do have a discussion paper out there, comment deadline February 15th, 2017. So for those of you who are interested in looking at that and responding to us, we'd be very, very grateful to receive all and any input on this particular project. For this one, we've also doing something a little bit new. We're going to put in place a project advisory panel, and we will be announcing the members of that panel shortly. And what we're trying to do there is to get together preparers, investors, internal auditors, academics, and some practitioners to really provide some input and insight to our working group, because we recognize that many people are coming with some very lots of different perspectives, and we want to really try to make sure we have broad-based feedback as we move forward. Right, so let me talk briefly about agreed upon procedures. This is another project that we've had on our agenda for a fairly long time, and unfortunately it's been a project that we've had to stop and start a little bit. So when we put our focus on auditor reporting, we had to kind of put this one on hold a little bit, and now we've put it back onto the main track. And we have a discussion paper that was just recently published, which highlights some of the key features of agreed upon engagement, agreed upon procedure engagement, and asks for really views on these issues, and that really will help inform us as to what we need to do with the standard going forward. So we have an extant standard out there that is a relatively old standard. It's actually in the pre-clarity format. However, we do recognize that this is an important standard, and it is used widely, particularly in the SMP community. So it is an important standard for us to modernize and update at a minimum. But we're also interested in hearing about, some of the issues that we have outlined in our paper as to whether there's additional things that we should be doing and thinking about as we enhance the standard. The paper also explores or attempts to explore the demand for engagements that might be combined. So maybe what we're calling multi-scope engagements. So maybe you have engagement that has some element of a reasonable assurance engagement, maybe limited assurance, and then maybe it's combined with a non-assurance type of engagement or procedures, such as agreed upon procedures. And we don't specifically have that concept or hotline. So that's also out there with a deadline the end of March next year. Let me talk briefly then about our external reporting discussion paper. I mentioned this one earlier. This is a discussion paper that is exploring a very broad topic. So it's the emerging forms of external reporting. It actually started as a project to look specifically at integrated reporting, and emerged into, well, that's not really the only form of emerging external reporting. So we looked at broadening the scope of this discussion paper and really set out on setting out the types of things or the factors that really can enhance credibility and trust, and what is the role of the IAASB in terms of having standards that will address these types of issues. So the paper explores the types of services that are covered today by our standards, and the kind of challenges that could be addressed in future standard setting. We're also trying to explore the demand and trying to really gauge what should the auditor be doing. Also, what should the auditing standards for, so the IAASB be doing in this area. So what is really the right time to do some standard setting? Does include integrated reporting, and we have a comment deadline of February 2017 on that one. Okay, so I know we're wrapping up here, just a couple more minutes. I have a slide, and I know Dawn's going to get into this in a lot more detail in the next session to talk about addressing the needs of SMPs. So I think through the remarks that I've made, I've tried to highlight in a couple of places where we really are trying to focus on the needs of SMPs as we go about our projects. Currently, audits of small entities are considered throughout the ISAs, but there really is a growing need or we hear the call for us to do more to assist with the application of the ISAs to these audits. And this is not limited to just SMPs, because even larger firms can have audits that are on the smaller end of the spectrum. So we do have a focus on scalability and considering our changes. So like I mentioned, when we're talking about our thinking around quality control, we really are trying to focus on scalability. We're doing a lot of outreach to SMPs to really understand practical implications, and we understand that change is challenging, but we also understand that the current standards are challenging. So we really want to try to look at, are there things that we can do? Are there things that others have done? So are there tools or guidance that have been developed to assist internationally? And really trying to think about what more is needed. We do have an IAASB conference that's planned in Paris in 2017 in January, and that's going to be a 2-day session where we're hoping that we will have a large number of SMP practitioners from around the world to come together and really brainstorm and provide input to the IAASB about what is going on today and what can be done to really address not only audit but also other services that are being performed by SMPs. So we're excited that there will be some really good thinking and good input that will come out of this working conference. Okay, so just to wrap up then, let me look at our work plan for 2017 and 18, which we approved at our December 2016 meeting last week. We concluded that we would, actually we're just on the next slide, we concluded that we would continue to work on our priority projects, so the ones that I've been talking about, 540, 315, quality control, and group audits. We need to get those done. Once we get to having a lot of those at the exposure draft stage, we thought that maybe there's a potential to add a project that would deal with audit evidence, and this would pick up the professional skepticism, it would pick up data analytics, it would pick up documentation, and potentially some of the other ISAs, so analytical procedures and sampling, and try to think about the effect from those standards of things like data analytics and more innovative technologies and techniques that auditors are starting to use to do audits today. The agreed upon procedures project, as I mentioned, and the project there will be somewhat dependent on the input that we get to the discussion paper, but at the minimum I expect that we will have a clarity redraft of the extant standard. And then based on what we hear from the discussion paper on emerging forms of external reporting, we'll decide what we need to do. And then some of these will really begin probably not in 2017, because I think 2017 is pretty heavy to just work on the projects that we have done. But as we have capacity at the board level and the staff level, we will look at the projects I have about, but we also might start to think about is there room for another project, and some of the other candidates might be, for example, materiality. We'll also continue to monitor the International Accounting Standards Board and think about is there anything that's coming out of their agenda that we should be focused on. So my last slide is just a picture, excuse me, which shows the expected timing of some of the exposure drafts that we have coming. So it's going to be a busy time, as you can see, and we're just on the last slide right now. That shows the timeline, sorry, excuse me, of the targeted dates for our EDs. So I won't go through all of them, but you can see it's going to be a pretty busy time for us from in 2017 and 18 with our EDs and final standards that we're working towards. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dawn, and I look forward to being able to respond to some of the questions in the Q&A time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan. Thank you for briefing us about all these initiatives, and as you mentioned, it looks like a very busy agenda. We will be all looking forward to see what comes next. Let me now pass on to Dawn, who will talk about the initiatives of the IFAC Small and Medium-Sized Practices Committee. Dawn, over to you.
Thank you, Kalina, and thank you to each of you for being here today. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to tell you about the activities of the SMP Committee. So moving to the first slide, the things that I want to cover today are specifically about the SMP Committee, the input that we provide to the standard setting boards, specifically the Auditing and Assurance Standards Board and the Ethics Standards Board, the types of tools and guidance that we have available, all of which is free of charge, and then the activities that we have around global representation and advocacy. So first, I want to begin with an overview of the committee itself. The overriding purpose is to represent the interests of the SMP in all that we do. And the way that we do that is that we meet in person 3 times a year, but the greatest percentage of our work and time is spent through email and conference calls. We have 18 members from around the world, and they are also supported by technical advisors. We have 22 countries in all that are represented, so that provides us with a great breadth and ability to share our experiences globally and to really drill in on what those SMP views are. In the activity areas, we have 3 main focuses. The first is the input to policy and regulation, and of course, all of the standards that Megan was addressing, as well as the standards coming out of the Ethics Standards Board. And the greatest proportion of our time is spent there. In any given year, we have 35 to 45% of our time. Next are the tools, and I'm going to go through a number of those tools that we have available for you during my presentation. And then we have the promotion of the SMP community and their SME clients. Our work plan and activities are in line with the IFAC strategy, and you can find a copy of that on the IFAC website. We have organization within the committee through 6 task forces in the main target areas that we're required to address. And for my part, I chair the Implementation Guidance Task Force. So many of the guides that I'm going to tell you about today fall under my remit. So the first area of focus on the next slide are the 2 task forces that we have that respond to the consultation papers, exposure drafts, invitation to comment, and all those kinds of things. We also inform ourselves of the various projects and key issues by having representatives from the respective boards come to our meeting. And this provides us a face-to-face opportunity to really understand what it is that's being developed and to have at a grassroots level input into that standard setting process. We also have representatives from the committee that are on various working groups, such as the Quality Control Working Group, the Agreed Upon Procedures, and the ISA 315. I also have the privilege of serving as the Consultative Advisory Group observer to the IAASB and the IAASB CAG meetings. And even though it is the role of an observer, they do allow me speaking rights, which is important. And during my 2-year tenure being involved at that level, I have found them very receptive to the SMP views and certainly seen a shift in trying to be more sensitive to the issues that we struggle with. Some of the more recent things that we've been involved with, starting first with the IAASB, we responded to the invitation to comment, the enhancing audit quality in the public interest that Kalina mentioned in her opening remarks. We've also submitted comment letters on the ISA 315, ISA 540, data analytics, NOCLAR, and the agreed upon procedures. So you can see from that we've had a very busy year, and from what Megan has outlined, next year looks even busier than the year we've just come through. We've also had a number of conference calls with the various working groups and or task forces that are working on those projects. And again, they come to us with particular questions or issues and receive our feedback at that point so that each step of the process we have feedback. For the IAASB, I've attended the CAG meetings, the same as I just mentioned for the IAASB. We've also had feedback on 3 different exposure drafts, those being the safeguards, structure of the code, and long association, and more recently, the fees initiative and safeguards project. Our second area of focus on the next slide are the resources and tools. So next slide, please. One of the more recent offerings that we just launched a couple of months ago is a brochure, which is entitled Choosing the Right Service, Comparing Audit Review, Compilation, and Agreed Upon Procedure Services. Our aim with this particular brochure was to have something that we could put into the hands of the SMP that they could use to market each of those services to their clients. We appreciate that in a lot of jurisdictions, audit exemptions have either recently been introduced or are about to be introduced or have been raised. And so for firms that have been primarily relying on audit as a main revenue stream, they're moving into a new world where they have to shift those kinds of services. So we thought it was timely to develop and release this brochure so that the firm will have an opportunity to market these other services, whether they're assurance or non-assurance, and really diagnose what they may need. Certainly the SMP sees the value in the audit and all the good reasons why that service might be a preferred service. However, for the client that considers that a commodity, you may have an opportunity, for example, to have a non-assurance service offering, but that could be augmented with one of these other things, such as an agreed upon procedures engagement, for example. One of the very nice things about the brochure is that it will also allow the firm to insert their particular details, their local details on there, so that it really looks as though it's coming directly from the firm to their SMP. Okay, now I'm going to move on to a discussion of the guide offerings that we have. The committee has published 4 standards-based guides. Next slide, please. And these provide in-depth practical coverage on how to implement the subject matter requirements. So the first of these guides was the guide to using ISAs in the audit of SMEs. We originally published this document in 2007. The most recent edition was published in November 2011. When we initially published it, it was following the effective date of the clarified ISAs, and I'm sure we all remember how we felt when those clarified ISAs originally came out, because we went from a handbook that was about this size, we felt like suddenly it had gone to this size. So we really wanted to enable the practitioners to develop a deeper understanding of the audit conducted in compliance with those clarified ISAs. So we broke the guide into 2 different volumes. The first, which is Core Concepts, Volume 1, and that is very useful for training purposes. Then we have Volume 2, which is the practical guidance, and that drills down more to the engagement level. For the accounting organizations, you will also find that we've published a companion guide, and this will explain to the member bodies how they can make best use of the guide. By way of update, in June 2016, the committee approved a project proposal to update the ISA guide. As I'm sure you're all familiar, there have been a number of revised or new ISAs, and so the scope for that 4th edition is to bring the document up to date, and we expect to publish that in early 2017. It will be effective for audits of financial statements for periods ending on or after December 15, 2016. So we'll be getting into everybody's hands just in time for when they will need it. Next, we have the Guide to Quality Control. Next slide, please. And this helps the SMPs apply ISQC1 proportionately and effectively. The ISQC1 came into effect December 15th, 2009. For this particular publication, it's available in 26 translations, as opposed to the 20 translations that are available for the ISAC guide. And importantly, in this document, you'll find sample quality control manuals. Those are very useful because you're not going to be stuck having to develop all of the requirements on your own. We've guided you through that process. There are 2 sample manuals in there, one which is specifically designed for a sole practitioner that has non-professional staff, and the second sample which is applicable to a 2 to 5 member firm. The third standards-based publication that we have on the next slide is the Guide to Review Engagements. This is based on ISRE 2400. That particular standard was issued in September 2012, and it came into effect for December 31st, 2013. So this is a case where the practitioners is engaged to perform a review of historical financial statements. And as is the case with all of our publications, it provides non-authoritative guidance, which means that while all of these tools are very helpful, we still do expect the practitioners to read the standards themselves. This document has been downloaded approximately 7,000 times in its very early life, and we have 3 translations that are currently available and 4 more that are in progress. Importantly, you're going to find, if you go and have a look at this document, that there are many, many practice aids that have been included that are useful in actually conducting the review engagement. The last and most recent publication on the next slide that was published to support the IAASB standards is the Guide to Compilation Engagements. This is a publication that I personally authored, and it was released last fall. This guide addresses the responsibilities of a practitioner that is engaged to perform a compilation of general purpose historical financial statements. Importantly, though, that are prepared in accordance with an applicable financial reporting framework. We are aware that compilation standards in various jurisdictions do not necessarily require application to a particular gap, but if you look at the requirements of ISRS 4410, it does have to be in compliance with an AFRF. So ISRS 4410 came into effect for compilation engagement reports dated on or after July 1st, 2013. In approximately the 1 year that it has been available, it's been downloaded 4,300 times, but currently we don't have any translations that are offered. So we'd be very interested to hear if there are any intentions amongst all of you folks that are joining us today, if any member bodies are interested or have plans to translate that document. As is the case with all of the other guides that I've just mentioned, it also provides useful tools. In this particular guide, we have a sample engagement checklist, a sample engagement letter, and a file completion checklist. So moving to the next slide, this guide is different from the others that I've just mentioned because it is not intended to assist the SMP with standards implementation. Sorry, next slide, please. There we go. But rather was intended to assist the SMP with various aspects of their practice management and practice development. It's been released for a number of years, but we do have an update that will soon be coming to you. There's a whole range of practice management topics in this document. We have planning, practice models and networks, how to build and grow your firm, how to develop a people strategy, technology and e-business, client relationship management, risk management, and succession planning, all again free of charge. And for many SMPs who feel quite isolated or alone, maybe don't have a large network, there's just all kinds of useful information in this document. The guide is being updated right now, specifically with a new chapter on technology and e-business, because we appreciate from the last time that it was released, things are moving at such a rapid pace, and we want to make sure that we keep that current. So I now want to move on to the Global Knowledge Gateway on the next slide. This gateway has been available for almost 3 years now, and it's a platform that brings together news, views, resources, and thought leadership throughout the accountancy profession. What you'll find on this site is content that comes from IFAC, that comes from member organizations, and other notable groups and individuals. And this is IFAC's response. They had been hearing loud and clear that they needed to have a repository or an ability to exchange with others, and so the gateway came to be. So here you will find resources from all around the world. You have the ability to learn about emerging issues. You can stay connected with what is going on within the profession. And it also, in many of the areas that you go, it provides you an opportunity to post your own views or to exchange with another professional, which is perhaps one of the most exciting elements about the gateway. You'll find that all of the information is organized into 10 different topic areas, from business reporting, ethics, financial leadership, governance, financial and performance management, risk management and internal control, sustainability, audit and assurance, practice management, and Islamic finance. There is also another publication called The Latest, which is a bi-weekly newsletter that summarizes all of this information every couple of weeks. And if you visit the IFAC website, you can go ahead and subscribe to that publication and pick the focus areas that you're most interested in, and then that will come to you directly via email. So I'm now going to move on to our third area of focus, which is global representation and advocacy. As you're aware, IFAC speaks out on behalf of both SMPs and SMEs in its interactions with regulators, standard setters, and policymakers. Next slide, please. This year, we participated in a number of activities. The May SMP Regional Forum that took place in Jamaica, that was the second of its kind, organized with ICAJ and was supported by ICAC. This covered global opportunities and challenges for SMPs, audit quality, and building a successful practice. And in Sri Lanka, it covered the proportionate application of ISAs and ISQC1 and future-ready SMPs. This was in addition to 15 other external presentations that were undertaken by various members of the SMPC. Through the Public Policy and Regulation Task Force of the committee, we provided input into IFAC's public policy and regulation activities, such as fraud and corruption, the draft 2016 G20 call to action and a draft letter to FEE on its consultation on the future of corporate reporting. Our SMPC chair is always very busy and is involved in a number of outreach activities on our behalf as well. This year, the chair attended an IFAC ICAEW roundtable from crisis to confidence, the role of good regulation. That was in July in London, and it convened senior executives and experts from regulators, financial markets, government, academia, and so forth. And the debate focused on the regulation of financial markets, business, and reporting. On the next slide, I want to tell you a bit about another publication that we have available, which is an academic literature review. Academics have summarized and discussed the findings of more than 90 academic research papers and reports. So it was initially published post-2010, but has recently been updated. And you'll find covered in here all types of subject matter that relates to both SMPs and SMEs. So it tells us about the SME and demand for business support. As we're all aware, SMEs represent a very significant part of the world's economy. These entities represent between 85% to 99.9% of the business population and account for more than half of the private sector value added and 2/3 of employment. So those are some pretty staggering numbers. But we also appreciate that SMEs are very diverse in their size, growth intentions, and business goals, and a significant proportion of them are family enterprise that is characterized by family involvement in ownership, governance, management, and their individual family values. What we've learned is that only a subset of SMEs are interested in growing or seeking maximum return on their businesses because many of them choose to remain small or not grow. And this may be because of a lifestyle choice, or they're managing their families, or whatever the case may be. But this particular group attached considerable importance to non-financial objectives. So it's important for us to keep that in mind. They prefer to pursue a range of other goals rather than growth. Factors that drive an SME's demand for business advice from us, the SMP, among others include company, so for example, size, debt, available resources, and environment-related factors, such as economic conditions, including regulations and competition. The personal characteristics of the SME owner-manager also impact the decision of whether or not they purchase accounting advice. Some owner-managers are more open than others to seeking and utilizing that external advice. Personal factors, including their relationship, trust, perceived value of services, and they all moderate the impact of the company and the environment-related factors on the SME's demand for business advice. So what does that tell us specifically about the SMP and the SME relationship? The research indicates that irrespective of the jurisdiction, accountants and especially SMPs continue to be preferred advisors to the SME. The main factors the SME considers when determining whether or not to purchase SME services include any prior relationship that they have with us, the image that we present, and the SME's perception of the roles and competencies of accountants. Industry, the type of advice, and the personality of the SME owner-manager also impact the selection of the advisor. So due to the multitude of factors involved, interactions between us and the SME are quite complex. In general, the desired interaction embodies a long-term personal relationship that's based on trust and communication. The literature, though, reveals the complexities in that trust is not easy for the SMP to obtain, and it's also linked to other factors such as our integrity, our competence, and the empathy that we have the ability to exhibit to our clients. In general, recent literature indicates that the SME most likely purchasing that business advice are larger SMEs, they're younger SMEs, they carry higher levels of debt, or they have greater aspirations to obtain new funding, or they exhibit higher growth rates or intentions to grow. Market segments such as startups, SMEs with the ambition to grow, SMEs that have lifestyle expectations, or steady state SMEs facilitate an understanding of the demand for business advice from SMPs. So on the next slide, we have more findings. The majority of SMP's revenue is generated by traditional services. There we go. Yeah. Including compliance, audit, and taxation. But recent literature identifies an increase and diversification in the provision of business advisory services, and it importantly highlights the associated potential for future revenue growth. And I'm going to talk more about that when I get into the early findings that we have from the 2016 Global SMP Survey. So what does that mean in terms of the strategy for the SMP? Recent research furthermore reveals that differences exist in SMPs offering of the business advisory services by geographic region, size, and strategy. Larger and more proactive SMPs offer more of these business advisory type services. It also shows that SMPs have differing expansion strategies. Some SMPs are reluctant while others are proactively seeking to expand their service offerings. So what we find is those that perhaps are quite adverse to the new reality of audit exemptions, for example, or just don't find that they have the ability to move into these other areas or niches, and those that are embracing that. The desire to expand is influenced by factors such as the size of the firm, level or availability of competencies, whether they belong to a network, the type of access that they have to training, whether clients are demanding that, and geographic location. So the expansion choices are often influenced by the level of diversification, appetite for risk, and the growth aspirations of the firm itself. In terms of marketing, the research also indicates that communicating with the SME owner-manager is challenging for SMPs. So are we really comfortable in marketing our services, particularly new services, to our clientele? This is because of perceptions associated with a low level of readability of traditional accounting documents such as financial statements. While the development of digital communication channels has created new ways for us to communicate with our clients, research suggests that the preferred form of communication between SMEs and ourselves remains that face-to-face contact. This can be important, though. I think we do have to recognize that we have to move with the times, but that face-to-face time with your client provides a greater opportunity to maintain that personal relationship, which is, of course, what leads to that trusted advisor role and also client loyalty. Recent literature additionally suggests that traditionally SMPs have been passive. I can certainly relate to that. I know that we have within my own firm rainmakers, but then we also have those like myself that prefer to just work the work. But we can't remain that way, or we need to recognize the new reality, particularly with the younger generation. So conventionally, formal promotion such as media advertising has rarely been employed. Some accountants view marketing and promotion as incompatible with the profession or not as worthwhile to counter competition. Researchers have recently emphasized the need for greater proactivity from the SMP in gaining new business. And in some demographics, this may really be mission critical, particularly in an aging population, because simply your clients are going to die off. Finally is the notion of networks, and the literature indicates that networks play a growing role in the expansion of SMP expertise. This becomes ever increasingly more important with the pace of change, both technology-wise and standards-wise. It is increasingly difficult to maintain your competence and to have all the bases covered. And so by being part of a network or being part of a larger firm, you're better able to cover all of those bases. We also need that network for attracting new clients and providing new services. SMP networks and networks of SMPs with other professionals, such as bankers, lawyers, HR, and environmental specialists, facilitate the broadening of expertise and visibility to clients. In essence, what you want to do is create a one-stop shop for your client. And even if your firm can't provide the service, being able to provide a solid referral to your client is greatly valued by them. So now I'd like to move on to telling you about another of our important SMP initiatives, that of the Global SMP Survey. The 2015 survey did much to garner feedback from around the globe. Incredibly, this was open in 22 languages. That represented a lot of effort on behalf of our committee, because we went out to our contacts, we went out to our representatives on the committee and specifically said, would your member body assist us in translating this document? Oh, I'm sorry, it's the slide. There we go. The 2015 had a staggering 6,725 responses, and we believe that that makes it the world's largest study ever of SMPs and likely of accountants in general. The full report was published early last year, and it was disseminated to the 170 plus member organizations within IFAC as well. So what do we ask about in this survey? We ask about your practice performance and outlook. We ask about your SMP individually, and we also ask about the challenges that your SME clients are facing. So we're pleased to share with you the early results from the 2016 on the next slide. However, I do need to emphasize that this is on a confidential basis, and the numbers are subject to change because we are still working on collating all of the information as the survey has recently closed. So there are 4 greatest challenges faced by SMPs, those being attracting new clients, fee pressure, keeping up with new standards and regulation, and differentiating yourself from the competition. Over the next 5 years, the challenges seem to have the greatest impact. Not surprisingly, the regulatory environment, technology, and again, competition. The top challenges that were rated high or very high are consistent to 2015 and 2014. So things are not changing for us very much in terms of what's keeping us awake at night. Respondents rated 8 environmental factors to indicate the extent to which they believed each might impact the SMP over the 5 years. And the largest change to the number was technology developments, where we saw that the impact has increased. On the next slide, you can see the top 3 technology issues. And these are particularly poignant decisions for SMPs because we're often making those decisions in isolation. We may not have technological expertise ourselves, so we're kind of hoping and praying that the decisions we make and implement in our practice are the right ones. And we also have financial constraints. The resources that we have available are very likely not as significant a percentage of our revenue as you would see in a larger practice. So what are the issues? Investing in or staying current with software, getting into a digital paperless environment, and determining what technology is best for us. So the combined totals of moderate, high, and very high ranged from 55 to 73%. So this really is keeping us awake at night and is an extremely significant issue for us. The top 3 personnel and staffing issues, I don't think these have ever changed over time. Finding qualified staff, retaining those qualified staff once we have them, and how do we continue to deliver technical training to the staff that we have available to us. The combined totals here for moderate, high, and very high range from 63% to 74%. On the next slide, we have how we believe we performed in 2016 across the various service lines, and 32 to 37% revenues stayed the same. So the results very comparable to 2015, and for 25 to 30% revenues increased moderately. In the auditing and assurance, 25% increased moderately, while 33% stayed the same. If you look, though, at the advisory and consulting, a very interesting result, 29% increased moderately, 36% stayed the same. Tax, 26%, 37% said they stayed the same. So note here how the audit and assurance results came in with the lowest forecast for fee increases when compared to the other services. Projected increases are consistently last year in this in the advisory and consulting services, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So if we look at the next slide, respondents were asked to specify the types of advisory and consulting services that they were providing. And this is important because, as we saw in the previous slide, this is where the growth is. So 49%, it was in corporate advisory, management accounting, 45%. And then we moved down into the HR, business development, restructuring, and so forth. So 84% of SMPs that responded to this survey, which is the same percentage that responded in 2015, are providing some form of consulting service. So this is good news, particularly for jurisdictions or firms that were focused exclusively on providing assurance services. You can see that life will continue even after the audit exemption or the raising of the audit threshold. On the next slide, we then asked the respondents to tell us what are the challenges that your clients are facing, and economic uncertainty came in at 61%, rising costs 60%, competition, and finally difficulties accessing finance. So those are insightful highlights about what's keeping our clients awake at night. And interestingly, the results indicate either no change or very little change from last year, which means that these challenges are serious and they are enduring. So now I want to talk a little bit about what we'll be working on next and what you can be watching for. With everything that we do, it aligns to the IFAC strategy for 2016 and 2018. We're going to continue to focus on those three main activity areas that I talked about at the beginning of my presentation, but I'll share with you more specifically what falls into these buckets. For the standard setting boards, we have a number of plans for comment letters and conference calls. We're going to be continuing with those task forces that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. I'll be continuing with the consultative advisory group observer role, and we anticipate that our activity is going to be much higher. If I look at our current work plan, it indicates that 45% of our time is going to be spent directly in this area. You saw all of the standards that are going to be being worked on in Megan's presentation. So the ISA 315, 540, 600, 220, ISQC1, the Professional Skepticism Project, all of those things are going to be keeping us incredibly busy as we represent the views of the SMPs. As we understand it, the board may be meeting 5 times this year. We're usually providing our input in advance of those meetings, and so we will definitely be working hard to coordinate all of that feedback. In terms of the resources and tools that you can look for that will be new and exciting and available on the IFAC website in 2017, we will be launching that update to the Practice Management Guide. So this is the non-standards related guide I spoke about earlier in the presentation. The update to the ISA guide, also covered earlier. We're going to be finalizing and launching an agreed upon procedures engagement publication. As you heard Megan mention, they are working on updating that standard. We are trying to align our strategy within the SMP committee to that work and trying to generate some interest or excitement around that standard. We understand that in many jurisdictions, practitioners, particularly the SMP, may be performing or offering AUP engagements without even realizing that there is a standard that applies to them. And we also want to provide in that publication a number of examples so the SMP can look at that and diagnose, hey, this is a particular engagement type, and then they could possibly use the brochure to market it, for example. We are also going to be participating in a number of roundtables. We're going to continue to contribute articles and resources and news to the Gateway. And we are also going to have a publication on integrated reporting for SMEs. In terms of global representation and advocacy, we're going to be releasing the final results of the 2016 survey. So collating all of those feedbacks that I was just covering in the recent slides. We're going to be continuing to participate in presentation and speeches, as well as input into the public policy and regulation. So lastly, I want to cover with you how you can gain access to all of the resources. If you go to the IFAC website and you click on the SMP committee link, there you will find access to the meeting highlights, and that'll keep you informed of all of the current activities that we're involved in, as well as the projects that we're working on. And then you'll be able to access those new resources or find out our positions on various things by keeping up to date. You can also follow us on Twitter, look for the final survey results as I just mentioned, join us on LinkedIn, engage in the various discussions that we have going on there, and perhaps put as one of your favorites on your Internet, the Global Knowledge Gateway. So that concludes my presentation, and I look forward to responding to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dawn, and thank you also for sharing this unique opportunity to look at the unofficial results of the survey. We are all very interested and looking forward to see the complete study when it's available. Let me now start with some questions that participants have previously shared with us. Actually, some of the questions I think were touched upon in both of yours and Megan's presentation, but let me start with one that I think is maybe interesting to ask, and then I would hand over to Megan first and then to Dawn. So the first question is relating to, we heard from Megan's presentation about the plans to change auditing standards and how many changes are on the way. So maybe one of the first questions is, this is pretty difficult probably in practice for the PAOs and for the members to keep up keeping up with the translations, with the education resources and so on. So what are the perspectives of both the IAASB and the IFAC SMP Committee on the pace of these changes? And what are the external discussions regarding the benefits versus the costs, and any tips and ideas you can share with the participants on cost-effective ways to keep up with all this change? So over to you, Megan, first, and then you can hand down to Dawn for the same question. Thank you.
Sure, Kalina, thank you, and thanks for the question. And you know, obviously, it's a really good question, and we absolutely realize that that there is a lot of challenge associated with change to standards. So you know, I think hopefully through the remarks that I've made, you've got a feeling or an impression that we are definitely cognizant of this issue, and then really trying to really be focused on the needs of SMPs as we go through the various different revisions of our projects. You know, obviously we're not taking our changes lightly, and we really are trying to make sure that the changes we are making are responsive to issues that have been put in front of us, and the views of respondents. You know, so for example, that's why we've gone through a very big, thorough process to do our invitation to comment. You know, we've got 87 commentators from a lot of different stakeholders around the world, many of whom represented interests of SMPs, and obviously importantly the IFAC SMP Committee as a very important constituent there. So we are very focused on those issues and challenges, and I think as we go through the effort on our key projects, a lot of what we're focused on right now is the concepts of scalability and proportionality. So looking at how the requirements can be scaled for different circumstances, and then really making it clear in the standards what requirements might only be applicable in certain circumstances, so that it becomes clear that, you know, for things that maybe are just far more complex situations, that you can kind of very clearly identify where those aspects are dealt with in the standards. And then I think, you know, the other call that we heard as we did our invitation to comment was the increasing call for examples and guidance. And I think we're continuing to think about ways in which we can demonstrate how the requirements might be applied to varying circumstances, so ranging from more simple environments to more complex environments, with the hope that that really better enables practitioners to see how to effectively apply the requirements, and ultimately will make it you know, more cost effective to apply them. So you know, so I don't have a really easy silver bullet answer, because I totally understand that ongoing change is difficult, you know, but I do think that we are in an environment where the pace of change around us is very rapid. So we're dealing with rapidly changing environments that companies operate in. They're structuring themselves in different ways. Firms are doing different things. Maybe a little later we can talk a little bit about technology and innovative techniques and things like that. And I recognize everything is just very, very very challenging, but it's probably unlikely to slow down. So, I think we are trying at the IAASB level to be judicious in the changes that we make, and also not go down the path of trying to make piecemeal changes to a standard. And I think as you've probably heard, that the projects that we currently have on the agenda are big projects that involve some of our more complex and difficult to implement standards. So we're trying to deal with those holistically as opposed to a whole variety of piecemeal changes, because we recognize that makes it even more challenging. So maybe let me turn to Dawn and see if she has some thoughts as well.
Thank you, Megan. It is indeed difficult. There's no question about that, and it's difficult for both the PAOs and their respective SMPs. As you saw in the survey results for 2015, 44% of the SMPs that responded said keeping up with standards were either a high or very high challenge. And history is often a great predictor for what's going to happen in the future. So it's not surprising that 52% of them said they expected that to continue to be a high or very high challenge in the next 5 years. The SMPC has and continues to highlight the need to the IAASB to be sensitive to the burden of making those kinds of changes and to look at the benefits that it represents in terms of the public interest, and making sure that that balance is there. And the cost and the burden of adopting those revised standards is felt most acutely by the SMP. We don't have the in-house resources to easily implement any of those revisions. I'm fond of saying that many of our PAOs are actually SMEs themselves. And so implementing those changes in terms of delivering training to their members, in terms of translating the documents from English, represents a significant work effort. The committee has also argued that piecemeal changes to the requirements in isolated standards should be avoided wherever possible, and there should be a robust and rigorous cost-benefit analysis of the potential impact on both SMPs and SMEs in the board's consideration of future changes. We also believe that it is essential that the board maintain its ongoing monitoring of the implementation of the ICES, including consideration of their ability to be applied in a manner that's proportionate to the nature and size of the firm. You asked about how those changes could be implemented cost effectively. I know that when we look on a proportionate basis, it represents, again, more of a resource for the S&P than it does for a larger firm, but simply getting into a larger partnership or creating a network, whether that is a formal or informal network, and going about keeping yourself up to date using a divide and conquer strategy. You be responsible for tax, you be responsible for accounting, you be responsible for assurance, dividing those functional lines and keeping up that way, I think, is probably the only way forward, given how quickly standards are changing.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Dawn, for this answer. I'm going to skip the question we had on scalability, because I think both of you touched this topic a lot in your presentations and in your answer just now. Let me ask another question, which is also coming up recently, and it's revolving about data analytics and how there is potential for the audits, especially, and the opportunities to serve clients in a more focused and insightful way. Larger firms, internal audit departments, and so on are already seeing some benefits from these new technologies. But what can the SMPs expect in this area? What kind of tools, resources, education opportunities will be available in this emerging area to help them to keep pace with all of this change? So maybe Dawn, you would like to answer this question first, and then if Megan has something to add, she could probably add to that. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Kalina. The committee is really looking forward to providing our feedback into the IAASB exploring the growing use of technology. You heard Megan mention the deadline for responding is February the 15th.
Sorry, Dawn, Miss Silvia Dinova, can you please mute your computer because we're hearing you?
Silvia Dinova, please mute your computer.
Silvia Dinova, please mute your computer. We are hearing your conversation. I apologize for this interruption. I'm going to call once again to Silvia Dinova. If you can please mute your computer, we are hearing your private conversation. Thank you. Okay. Dawn, sorry for that. If you can continue with the question on the audit, the data analytics and the available resources for the SMPs. Thank you.
Sure. This is an issue that I think is going to be critical for smaller firms to understand. We can appreciate that the types of technique that's currently being developed is being developed by larger firms, but it's being adapted for smaller audit firms by providers of widely used auditing software. And these providers already have substantial data analytical tools available to them that have been developed in other sectors, and they are beginning to integrate that into their standard smaller audit software packages. So practitioners need to be aware of those developments. If they believe that the market for them is restricted just to larger firms, we wouldn't want to see them disadvantaged if the clients then start to demand use of data analytics, or in some respects, if it leads to a radically different audit approach that takes them by surprise. So we're doing what we can to inform our constituents of this emerging issue and following it very closely. What I would like to do is invite you to take a look at the Auditing and Assurance section of the Global Knowledge Gateway. There you will find information and resources. For example, it features an article from one of our SMPC members entitled Data Analytics for External Audits, and it highlights an ICAEW report on recent developments and fundamental questions about the opportunities that data analytics provides.
Thank you, Dawn. Megan, if you have some comment to add, we can take it now.
Sure, and I think Dawn gave some great advice there. You know, I think that this is a very exciting area. I think if people haven't already read our discussion paper, would certainly encourage people to do that. I think it, you know, kind of really tries to summarize the landscape. I think, like Dawn pointed out, there are a number of different articles and things that are available to be read and you know, kind of give you some information I mentioned when in the context of our project, we're looking to put together a project advisory panel, and I think what we're looking to bring onto that panel are a number of individuals who actually are acting as consultants to smaller practitioners, and providing advice on things that they can use and how to use some of these tools and techniques. So certainly, I'm hoping that will have input for us at the IAASB. But I think there are these types of organizations out there that are starting to to provide these services to smaller practitioners. So certainly would encourage people to start getting smart in this area and start trying to think about different ways in which you can kind of get involved, because some of the tools are very powerful, and we're really trying kind of at the beginning stages. So it's definitely an interesting and exciting area. And I think Dawn mentioned earlier the fact that when we look at our younger practitioners, this is the kind of stuff that really makes them excited. So I think it really is important to be engaged and to kind of get smart in this area.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks, Dawn. Let me now stop here and ask the participants on the field if there are any incoming questions from the VC locations or from the people connected via WebEx. If somebody would like to ask a question live, please unmute your microphones and you can go ahead now. Okay, in case there are no incoming questions at this time, let me pass over to Piotr, who has also a few questions to add to the speakers. So Piotr, over to you.
Thank you, Kalina. Thank you, Donna and Megan. We also have some questions we collected prior to this workshop from participants. You touched upon this subject in your presentations. However, it seems that these topics are still very interesting to our participants. That's why they want to find out a little bit more. So first one deals with non-audit services. Services other than audit are emerging and becoming more demanded by SMEs clients worldwide. Can you share some strategies and good practices that the profession can implement in developing markets to make these offerings visible to SME clients and stimulate further demand? If we can ask you both to answer this question briefly.
Okay, so if you would like to talk about this, Dawn, and then if Megan would have something to add, that would be a great sequence. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So I'll share a little bit, I think, from my own personal experience, which perhaps might offer some insights. I'm coming from Canada, and so for all of my career, we have had an audit exemption in place. So I've never known a life where it was not thus. And so what you'll find in Canada are multidiscipline firms, or otherwise referred to as full service firms. And interestingly, what you find, very much the audit is still a commodity in Canada. However, the client has come to you because there is a specific need, whether it's driven by a financing requirement or whether it is going to lead to a grant, this kind of thing. So they feel more about the audit as though it's an investment or a means to an end rather than just strictly a commodity. The other thing I think that you'll find is helpful, niching. So when you're going into these non-assurance services, rather than just trying to cover all of the bases, you find a lot of specialization. So in my particular firm, we have a specialty in cross-border taxation, and we also focus on the auditing and assurance accounting side of things, we've niched into not-for-profits because that allows us really to understand that particular sector of our clientele and to really meet the needs to the greatest extent that we can because they're unique to that client base. So I trust that that would be helpful. Again, I'm going to point you back to a couple of things that I said during my presentation, that being look to the survey results for additional insight into where the greatest growth opportunities lying in the business and advisory services. Make use of the brochure that we recently published. You'll find it on the website using the search term. Use the name of the brochure provided in the presentation, and it's been available since September. Use that to market to your clients, and look for the resources that we're going to have available on the AUP engagement, because that covers all kinds of different engagement offerings that you can make to your client and that will supplement a non-assurance service offering, particularly when there's a factual report that's required to be issued by the professional.
Thank you, Dawn. Megan, if you would have something to add on this question, we can take it now.
So, Kalina, and I think Dawn gave some great advice there and pointed to some great resources. I think, from an IAASB perspective, it's obviously an area that we're focused on. Like I mentioned, we have our AUP discussion paper, which is specifically trying to explore some of the evolving trends and maybe some of the multi-scope type of engagements. So I think, we're interested in what is happening and whether there is something that we should be doing at the IAASB level to make our standards more fit for purpose. And I think similarly, our EER paper, where we're looking at emerging trends in external reporting, again, that's really, trying to figure out exactly what is happening and where we should be playing. So, I think obviously from the IAASB perspective, our role is to support the profession. I don't think it's necessarily in the area of stimulating demand, but we really are trying to monitor the trends and make sure that we really are putting the right tools into the hands of the practitioners. So would recommend that people stay engaged in our consultation papers, and as the responses come in, we'll be summarizing those and providing input, so that also would be a useful source of information about things that are going on in different jurisdictions around the world.
Thank you, Megan and Dawn. The next question relates also to the very up-to-date topic, we believe, which is integrated reporting, which is also another clear sign that small and medium practitioners are trying to become more like a business advisor and not only provider of compliance services, if you like. So the question says, integrated reporting is gaining more and more exposure among large companies, both private and public ones, including public interest entities. What is your view on the development on integrated reporting and its relevance for smaller and medium-sized companies? Also, is there a role that SMPs can play in this process, and how? If I may ask maybe Megan to start with the answer, and then we will continue with Dawn. Thank you.
Oh, and thank you. I think this is obviously integrated reporting is a very interesting area, and it is one that is evolving. I think it's probably at different stages in different jurisdictions. It's clearly something that the IAASB has been monitoring and really looking at what is going on. I think, probably to date, it's very much jurisdictionally driven. And there are some requirements in a limited number of jurisdictions around the world where there is actually a requirement to do integrated reporting. But I think that those are largely focused on listed entities. But I also think or maybe the larger companies. But I think that the momentum is moving, and I think the interest is growing. And I think we'll start to see maybe some smaller and medium-sized companies taking some of this on. And I think some of this type of reporting could be very relevant the stakeholders of those kinds of companies. I think I mentioned in my remarks the fact that we have the IAASB is hosting an SMP conference in January, where we will spend some time looking at what's going on in the audit world and in the other assurance and the non-assurance world. I think that part of the discussions at that meeting will focus on some of these emerging trends. So I think we may learn more and we may hear about what different types of things are being done. Because the whole question around, again, assurance on integrated reporting is another one that I think it's still evolving. So the demand is evolving, and it's maybe not the traditional form of assurance. We could even have assurance being provided by other types of providers like internal auditors and what have you. So from an IAASB's perspective, we're monitoring this, and I think we're interested in the results of our discussion paper. So again, I know Dawn and her committee will be looking at that and hopefully providing some input through a comment letter to that discussion paper, which will be very, very interesting and relevant. And I think we'd look to hear from the broadest range of stakeholders. So that will be a great opportunity for SMPs to provide some input to the IAASB about things that they think we can do. But I think it's kind of an ongoing area where I think we'll continue to see a lot of evolution.
Thank you, Megan. Dawn, what is your opinion about it?
Well, I have lots to say on this topic. Right now, we're working on a publication, Creating Value for Your SME Through Integrated Thinking and Integrated Reporting. It's primarily intended to be an awareness-raising document, and it's highlighting how integrated thinking and integrated reporting can help SMEs to build a better understanding of the factors that determine value over the short, medium, and long term. And that integrated thinking leads to integrated decision making, which then in turn leads to better business outcomes for the business itself. So when you think about the SME environment, they might be interested in being involved in integrated reporting for a number of really good reasons. So for example, if they were creating the right strategy to enhance a business valuation, for example, if they were planning on transferring the business or doing some succession planning, because that would capture and report the strategy and impact of the business, or if they were tendering for more business going forward, for example, it would be a great way to differentiate themselves from the competition. So the other thing I think is that SMPs should look into their own client base and try to be proactive and identify those clients that might be interested in incorporating integrated reporting into their other reporting. We're going to be having an article on the Gateway for SMPs that will help them consider their own client list, and it will detail how they might focus on companies that are providing public services, for example, or local utilities, professional service firms, clients of that nature, so that they can start to identify where those opportunities exist.
Thank you, Dawn. Definitely, it's worthwhile to watch the Knowledge Gateway and also to read this new development about the integrated reporting. Dear participants, this is another chance for you to ask some questions. Please let us know if you have questions or which would you like to ask. So let me open the floor now to questions from the participants. Please flag if you would like to ask a question.
Okay, if we have no questions, let me thank you very much for the fantastic presentations and also the participants for their questions and their participation in this distance learning event. Let me just close with a few announcements. This distance learning event is recorded, and an edited recording of the presentations and the event will be soon available and shared with the participants of the Audit Train of Trainers workshops. Then let me also use the opportunity to advertise the upcoming workshop of the Audit Train of Trainers modules. So we will be having the physical workshop here in Vienna, March 15-16, 2017. So you may want to flag those dates. This workshop will be focusing on audit execution, test of controls, substantive procedures. It will be our pleasure to see you again in Vienna and reconnect since our last meeting. And till I see you again, let me wish everybody a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and all the best. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you very much.